The train whistle screamed through the Nebraska plains like a wounded animal, and Georgia Thornton pressed her gloved hand against the soot-stained window, watching the endless grassland give way to scattered buildings that somehow called themselves a town. Scottsbluff materialized from the dust like a mirage, all weathered wood and false-fronted buildings leaning into each other as if sharing secrets. And Georgia felt her heart sink into her stomach, because this God-forsaken place was supposed to be her fresh start, her escape from the suffocating parlors of Boston, where her late father's debts had turned her into a pariah among people she'd once called friends. The conductor announced their arrival in a voice roughened by years of smoke and distance, and Georgia gathered her carpetbag and the single trunk that contained everything she owned that the creditors hadn't seized. 23 years old and already starting over, already running from a life that had crumbled faster than sugar in rain. Her mother had died when she was 12, her father 3 months ago, and the teaching position in Scottsbluff was the only response she'd received from dozens of desperate letters sent west. The advertisement had promised room, board, and $40 a month to educate the children of settlers and ranchers in a town hungry for civilization. What it hadn't promised was comfort, familiarity, or a single friendly face. The train lurched to a stop with a grinding of metal on metal, and passengers began filing toward the exits, their faces showing various degrees of exhaustion and hope. Georgia waited until the aisle cleared before standing, smoothing her traveling dress even though it was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with the grime of 3 days' journey. Through the window, she could see the platform, such as it was, just a stretch of weathered planks where a few people waited to collect arriving passengers or cargo. None of them looked like they were expecting a schoolteacher from Boston. She stepped down from the train car, her boots finding the platform with a hollow thud that seemed to echo in the vastness of this place. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so bright it hurt to look at, nothing like the gentler, hazier skies of home. The wind hit her immediately, constant and insistent, carrying the smell of dust and distant cattle and something wild she couldn't name. Around her, passengers scattered toward waiting wagons or the town's main street, their greetings and conversations floating past her like tumbleweeds. "Miss Thornton," a woman's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and businesslike. Georgia turned to find a small, severe-looking woman in her 50s, dressed in black bombazine despite the May heat, her gray hair pulled so tightly against her skull it seemed to stretch her skin. "Mrs. Abigail Pembroke," Georgia presumed, the woman whose letters had been signed with such precise, unyielding penmanship that Georgia had immediately known what sort of person employed her. "Mrs. Pembroke," Georgia said, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting me." The woman's handshake was brief and efficient. "Your trunk will be delivered to the boarding house. Come along. The school committee is expecting us within the hour, and punctuality is a virtue I hope you possess." Not "welcome to Scottsbluff," not "I hope your journey was pleasant," just an immediate summons to be inspected like livestock at auction. Georgia swallowed her disappointment and followed Mrs. Pembroke off the platform toward the main street, her carpetbag growing heavier with each step. Scottsbluff revealed itself in pieces as they walked. The train depot sat at one end of town, and from there, the street stretched northward, lined with the usual establishments Georgia had read about in dime novels but never expected to see. A mercantile with windows displaying everything from flour sacks to saddles. A saloon called the Desert Rose, its doors propped open to reveal a dark interior and the ghost of piano music. A hotel with a sagging porch. A blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm beneath all other sounds. And people, more than Georgia had expected, moving between buildings with the purposeful stride of those who knew exactly where they belonged. She was not one of them. She was a stranger among strangers, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. "The school is at the north end of town," Mrs. Pembroke said without slowing her pace. "We have 47 students currently enrolled, ages 5 to 16. You'll teach all subjects, of course. The previous teacher left rather suddenly, so the children have been without proper instruction for 6 weeks now. I trust that won't prove too challenging for someone with your education." The way she said education made it sound like a questionable credential rather than an asset. Georgia had attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut before her father's fortune evaporated, had studied literature and mathematics and history with teachers who treated learning as something sacred. But here, in this dust-choked town at the edge of civilization, those accomplishments probably meant less than knowing how to shoot a rattlesnake or birth a calf. They turned down a side street, and Mrs. Pembroke stopped before a 2-story house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged on one side, and the front yard was nothing but hard, packed dirt and struggling weeds. "This is the boarding house where you'll reside. Mrs. Chen runs it. She's Chinese, but she keeps a clean establishment and charges fair rates. Your room and board are included in your salary, as specified in the contract." Before Georgia could respond, the front door opened, and a woman emerged, small and neat in a blue cotton dress, her black hair coiled at the nape of her neck. She couldn't have been more than 30, and her face held a cautious warmth that Mrs. Pembroke's lacked entirely. "Miss Thornton," the woman said, her English accented but clear. "I am May Chen. Your room is ready upstairs, second door on the right." "Thank you," Georgia said, genuinely grateful for even this small kindness. "I'm looking forward to staying here." Mrs. Pembroke made a sound that might have been approval or indigestion. "We'll collect you in 1 hour for the school committee meeting. Please make yourself presentable." She swept away before Georgia could point out that she'd just spent 3 days on a train and might need more than an hour to recover from the journey. But complaining wouldn't change anything, so Georgia followed Mrs. Chen into the boarding house, up a narrow staircase that creaked with each step, and down a dim hallway to her new room. It was small but clean, containing a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a wardrobe that listed slightly to one side, and a single window overlooking the street. Not much, but it was hers, and after months of depending on the grudging hospitality of distant relatives in Boston, having her own space felt like a luxury she hadn't dared hope for. "I bring hot water in 15 minutes, Mrs. Chen said from the doorway. "You need anything else, you tell me. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 6. No men in rooms, no loud noise after 9. You follow rules, we get along fine." "I'll follow the rules," Georgia promised, setting down her carpet bag. "And thank you again, Mrs. Chen. You're the first person who's made me feel even slightly welcome here." Something flickered in Mrs. Chen's eyes, sympathy perhaps, or recognition of what it meant to be an outsider. "This town full of strangers to you now, but strangers become friends if you give it time. You give it time, yes." She disappeared before Georgia could answer, leaving her alone in the small room with its slanting afternoon light and the constant sound of wind against the window. Georgia sank onto the bed, letting her carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. She wanted to cry, wanted to rage against the circumstances that had brought her here, wanted to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare, and she was still in Boston with her father alive, and the future spread before her like an unwritten page, but wanting wouldn't change reality. She was here in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, in the year 1882, and crying wouldn't improve anything. So she stood, unpacked the few belongings she'd brought in her carpet bag, and prepared to face the school committee with as much dignity as she could manufacture from exhaustion and despair. The hot water arrived as promised, and Georgia washed away as much of the journey's grime as possible, then changed into her least wrinkled dress, a dark green cotton that made her look older and more serious than her years. She pinned up her auburn hair, noting how the journey had left it dull and lifeless, and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. The woman in the wardrobe's small mirror looked tired and uncertain, but she would have to do, Mrs. Pembroke arrived exactly 1 hour after she'd left, her face showing no sign that she'd noticed or cared about being punctual to the point of rudeness. Georgia followed her back through town, this time heading toward a white clapboard building that sat slightly apart from the main street, surrounded by a yard of hard-packed earth and a few struggling cottonwood trees. The school, obviously, and the place where Georgia would spend most of her waking hours for however long she lasted in this position. Inside, the building smelled of chalk dust and old wood and the ghosts of countless students. One large room comprised the entire structure, with rows of benched desks facing a battered teacher's desk and a slate board mounted on the front wall. Windows on both sides let in the afternoon light, and a pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, waiting for winter. It was nothing like the bright, purpose-built classrooms of Miss Porter's, but it had a certain honest simplicity that Georgia found she didn't entirely hate. 5 people waited near the teacher's desk, turning as Georgia and Mrs. Pembroke entered. 3 men, 2 women, all dressed in their Sunday best despite it being Thursday, all watching Georgia with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. Members of the school committee, Mrs. Pembroke announced, "May I present Miss Georgia Thornton, lately of Boston, Massachusetts, our new school teacher." Georgia stepped forward, acutely aware of being examined from every angle. "Good afternoon. I'm grateful for the opportunity to teach here in Scottsbluff." The tallest of the men, a rangy fellow with steel-gray hair and a weathered face, stepped forward. "Hiram Walsh, chairman of the school committee. This is Reverend Josiah Harding, Mr. Samuel Kincaid, Mrs. Dorothy Harding, and you've already met Mrs. Pembroke. We have some questions about your qualifications, Miss Thornton." For the next hour, Georgia endured an interrogation more thorough than any examination she'd taken at Miss Porter's. They questioned her education, her teaching philosophy, her moral character, her religious beliefs, and even her reasons for leaving Boston, though she deflected that last question with a vague reference to seeking new opportunities in the West. She could tell they were suspicious of her, this educated Eastern woman landing in their rough frontier town, but she also sensed a desperate need beneath their skepticism. They wanted someone to educate their children, to bring a veneer of civilization to Scottsbluff, and Georgia represented their best option, possibly their only option. Finally, after what felt like days rather than hours, Hiram Walsh cleared his throat. "Very well, Miss Thornton. You'll begin Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Classes run until 3 in the afternoon, with a 1-hour break for lunch. You're responsible for all subjects and all grade levels. Any disciplinary problems should be addressed swiftly and firmly. We expect you to maintain proper moral standards both in and out of the classroom. Do you have any questions?" Georgia had 1,000 questions, but she sensed that asking them would only raise more doubts about her suitability. "No, sir. I'll be ready Monday morning." "Good." He nodded once, sharply, as if closing a business transaction. Meeting adjourned. The committee members filed out, leaving Georgia standing alone in the empty classroom with the afternoon sun slanting through the western windows. This was her kingdom now, her responsibility, her chance to prove she was more than just a desperate woman fleeing scandal and debt. She ran her hand across the teacher's desk, feeling the grain of the wood worn smooth by previous occupants, and tried to imagine herself standing here day after day, year after year, slowly becoming part of this town's landscape. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it filled her with a loneliness so profound she had to grip the desk's edge to stay upright. She left the school as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never existed in Boston's urban haze. Mrs. Pembroke had disappeared along with the other committee members, leaving Georgia to find her own way back to the boarding house. She didn't mind. The walk gave her a chance to see more of Scottsbluff, to begin the process of transforming this collection of buildings into something resembling home. She was passing the Mercantile when a commotion erupted from one of the side streets. Loud voices and the thunder of hoofbeats, and a woman's scream cut short. Georgia froze, her Eastern instincts warring with her Bostonian upbringing that said a lady never involved herself in street disturbances. But before she could decide whether to flee or investigate, 3 horses burst into view, their riders whooping and firing pistols into the air, and Georgia stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the Wild West she'd read about in newspapers, the dangerous, lawless frontier that civilized people spoke about in hushed, scandalized tones. She pressed herself against the Mercantile's wall as the riders thundered past, and in that moment, she understood exactly how far from Boston she'd come. "Easy there, miss. They're just letting off steam." The voice came from her left, low and calm, with an accent that softened the consonants and drew out the vowels in a way Georgia had never heard before. She turned and found herself looking at a man who seemed to embody everything she'd imagined about Western cowboys and nothing she'd expected all at once. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty shirt and vest. Dark hair showed beneath a wide-brimmed hat the color of desert sand, and his face was all strong lines and sun-weathered skin, with eyes the impossible blue of the Nebraska sky. He couldn't have been much older than she was, maybe 25 or 26, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. "I'm not accustomed to men firing guns in the street," Georgia said, trying to slow her racing heart. "In Boston, we have laws against such behavior." The corner of his mouth quirked up, not quite a smile, but something close. "This isn't Boston, miss, and those boys work for my father's ranch. They've been out on the range for 3 weeks, and they're just celebrating being back in town." No harm meant. No harm. George's fear was rapidly transforming into indignation, a much more familiar and manageable emotion. They could have shot someone. They could have trampled someone. That's not celebration, that's recklessness. Now he did smile, a slow, genuine expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made George's breath catch in her throat. "You're the new schoolteacher, Miss Thornton, isn't it? How did you know that? Town of 800 people, news travels fast. Especially news about someone as pretty as you coming all the way from Boston to teach our kids their letters." Georgia felt her cheeks flush, though whether from the compliment or his presumption, she couldn't say. "I suppose I should thank you for the warning about your father's employees, Mr. Beckett Zander." He touched the brim of his hat. "My father owns the XXX Ranch, about 10 miles northwest of town. I'm the foreman, which means those boys you saw are technically my responsibility, and I apologize if they frightened you. It won't happen again." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet authority that suggested when Beckett Xander made a promise, he kept it. Georgia found herself wanting to trust him, which was absurd considering they'd known each other for all of 3 minutes, and he was exactly the kind of rough, uncivilized Western man her father would have warned her against. "Thank you, Mr. Xander. I appreciate your consideration." "Beckett," he corrected. "We don't stand much on formality out here. And you're Georgia, according to Mrs. Chen, who mentioned you'd arrived on the afternoon train." "Miss Thornton in public," Georgia said, trying to maintain some sense of propriety even as she felt it slipping away like water through her fingers. "It wouldn't be appropriate for us to be on first-name terms when we've only just met." Something flickered in those blue eyes, amusement maybe or challenge. "All right, Miss Thornton, but you should know something about Scottsbluff. Out here we don't have the same rules as Boston. People are judged by what they do, not who they were back east. And strangers don't stay strangers for long in a town this size." "I'm perfectly content being a stranger," Georgia said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. "I'm here to teach, not to become involved in town politics or social entanglements." "Is that so?" Beckett tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and hold his gaze simultaneously. "Well, Miss Thornton, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in a place like this, you can't help but become involved. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone helps everyone. And whether you like it or not, by Monday morning you'll be one of us." "I seriously doubt that, Mr. Xander." "Beckett." "Mr. Xander," Georgia repeated firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to return to my boarding house before dark." She started walking, head held high, determined to put this unsettling encounter behind her. But she'd only gone a few steps when his voice followed her, carrying clearly over the constant wind. "You're not a stranger to me anymore, Miss Thornton. And something tells me that by the time summer's over, you won't be a stranger to Scottsbluff either." Georgia didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his words, just kept walking with her spine straight and her face carefully neutral. But her heart was pounding, and it had nothing to do with fear this time. That night, lying in her narrow bed in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling in for the night, Georgia tried to convince herself that Beckett Xander was wrong. She would remain apart, professional, uninvolved. She would teach her students, collect her salary, and eventually save enough to return east where she belonged. This was temporary, a necessary exile until she could reclaim the life she'd lost. But sleep was slow in coming, and when it finally arrived, her dreams were full of blue eyes and slow smiles, and a voice saying, "You're not a stranger to me anymore." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Georgia spent Friday at the school, reviewing the previous teacher's lesson plans and trying to organize the chaos of books, slates, and supplies that filled the rickety shelves along one wall. Saturday, she walked through town, introducing herself to the merchants and trying to learn the layout of this place that was supposed to be her home. People were polite but distant, clearly reserving judgment about the Eastern woman who'd come to educate their children. She saw Beckett Xander twice during those walks. Once, he was loading supplies onto a wagon outside the mercantile, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He tipped his hat to her, and she nodded back, maintaining the proper distance between teacher and rancher. The second time, he was riding down the main street on a magnificent bay horse, and he reined in when he saw her. "Miss Thornton, how are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Xander." "Beckett." "Mr. Xander," she repeated, though it was becoming harder to maintain the formality when he kept challenging it. "I'm preparing for Monday's classes." "My sister will be one of your students," he said, leaning forward in his saddle. Bonnie. She's 13 and thinks she's too old for school, but my father insists she continue her education. I hope you'll be patient with her." The mention of a sister was somehow humanizing, making Beckett Xander more than just an attractive cowboy who made her pulse race. "I'll do my best with all my students, Mr. Xander, including your sister. That's all anyone can ask." He straightened, gathering his reins. "If you need anything, Miss Thornton, anything at all, you let me know. The XXX may be 10 miles out, but we come to town regular. And like I said, people look after each other here." He rode off before she could respond, leaving her standing in the street wondering why his offer of help felt like something more than simple neighborliness. Sunday, Georgia attended services at the white clapboard church on the edge of town, sitting in the back pew and trying to focus on Reverend Harding's sermon about putting down roots in the wilderness. The church was full, every pew packed with families in their Sunday best, and Georgia felt the weight of curious stares throughout the service. She was still the outsider, the stranger, the unknown quantity that might prove to be a blessing or a disaster for their children's education. After the service, several mothers approached her, introducing themselves and their children, offering cautious welcomes laced with warnings about which students might prove troublesome. Georgia smiled and nodded and tried to remember names that all sounded similar to her Eastern ears. She was exhausted by the time she returned to the boarding house, wondering how she would possibly keep track of 47 students when she could barely remember the names of 5 mothers. Mrs. Chen had prepared a Sunday dinner of roast chicken and vegetables, and Georgia ate at the large table in the boarding house dining room alongside the other residents, a collection of men who worked in town or at nearby ranches. They were polite enough, but Georgia could feel their curiosity, their assessment of her, and she ate quickly before retreating to her room. That night, she laid out her clothes for Monday, her most severe dress and her hair pinned in a tight bun that made her look older and sterner than she felt. She reviewed her lesson plans until the words blurred on the page, and she finally blew out her lamp and tried to sleep. But anxiety kept her awake, replaying every horror story she'd ever heard about frontier schools, unruly students, parents who valued work over education, teachers run out of town for failing to maintain impossible standards. When dawn finally broke, painting her room in shades of pink and gold, Georgia rose feeling as if she hadn't slept at all. She dressed with trembling fingers, ate a breakfast she couldn't taste, and walked to the school with her heart lodged firmly in her throat. The building looked different at 7 in the morning, more solid somehow, more real. Georgia unlocked the door with the key Mrs. Pembroke had given her and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of chalk and wood and possibility. She wrote her name on the slate board in careful letters, arranged books on her desk, and tried to look like someone who knew what she was doing. At 7:45, the students began arriving. They came alone or in groups, some walking from town, others arriving on horseback or in wagons driven by parents who wanted to inspect the new teacher. Georgia stood at the door, greeting each one, trying to match faces to the names she'd been given. There was Tommy Walsh, the chairman's grandson, a freckle-faced boy of 8. Sarah and Samuel Kincaid, twins who looked at her with identical expressions of suspicion. Martha and Elizabeth Harding, the Reverend's daughters, prim and proper in matching dresses. And more, so many more, a flood of children ranging from tiny 5-year-olds clutching lunch pails to sullen teenagers who clearly resented being forced to attend school when they could be working. And then, Bonnie Xander walked through the door. She was unmistakably Beckett's sister, with the same strong features and blue eyes, though her dark hair hung in two long braids down her back. She was tall for 13, all awkward angles and barely contained energy, and she looked at Georgia with an expression that clearly said, "This is a waste of my time." "Miss Zander," Georgia said, determined to start off on the right foot, "your brother mentioned you'd be attending. I'm pleased to meet you." "I'm only here because Pa says I have to be," Bonnie replied, her voice carrying a hint of the same accent that softened Beckett's words. "Soon as I turn 14, I'm done with school. I don't need books to run a ranch." "Perhaps not," Georgia agreed, refusing to be baited. "But you might find that books can teach you things about the world that even the best ranch can't. Please take a seat, Miss Zander." Bonnie slouched to a desk in the back row, throwing herself into the seat with enough force to make the wood creak. Georgia made a mental note that this particular student would require careful handling. At 8 o'clock exactly, Georgia closed the door and faced her students. 47 faces looked back at her, ranging from eager to bored to openly hostile. This was it, her first day, her chance to prove herself or fail spectacularly. "Good morning," she said, projecting her voice to reach the back of the room. "I'm Miss Thornton, and I'm very pleased to be your new teacher. I know many of you are wondering about me, where I come from, what kind of teacher I'll be. So let me tell you a bit about myself, and then I want to hear from each of you." She spent the next 10 minutes sharing carefully selected details about her life, Boston, and her education without mentioning the scandal or the debts. Her journey west without revealing the desperation that had driven it. And then she began calling on students, asking them to stand and tell her their names, their ages, their favorite subjects. Some were shy, whispering their responses. Others were confident, even boastful. But gradually, the room full of strangers began to transform into individuals, each with their own personality and story. By lunchtime, Georgia's head was spinning with names and faces, and the challenge of teaching multiple grade levels simultaneously. She dismissed the students for their break, watching them spill out into the yard with shouts and laughter, and sank into her chair, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. "Miss Thornton." She looked up to find a small girl standing beside her desk, maybe 7 years old, with blonde braids and enormous brown eyes. "Yes. I just wanted to say I'm glad you're our teacher. The last one wasn't very nice. She yelled a lot." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest sincerity, made Georgia's throat tighten. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Lily Patterson. And I'm good at rating, but I'm terrible at sums. Will you help me get better at sums?" "I'll do my very best, Lily." The girl beamed and scampered away, and Georgia felt something shift in her chest. Maybe this wouldn't be a disaster after all. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. The afternoon proceeded more smoothly than the morning, and by the time Georgia dismissed the students at 3 o'clock, she was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. She'd managed to keep order, deliver lessons to 3 different grade levels, and only had to discipline 2 boys for fighting in the back of the room. Not a triumph, perhaps, but not a disaster either. She was erasing the slate board when the door opened behind her. She turned, expecting a parent with questions, and found Beckett Zander leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Zander, what can I do for you? Came to see how your first day went, and to hear what you thought of my sister." Georgia set down the eraser and faced him fully. "Your sister is intelligent and strong-willed. She's also convinced that education is a waste of her time. May I ask why?" Beckett stepped into the room, and somehow his presence made the space feel smaller, more intimate. "Bonnie's always been a ranch girl through and through. She can rope a calf, break a horse, and keep books better than most grown men. But my father wants her to have opportunities beyond the triple X, and that means education. What does Bonnie want? To be exactly like our father, to run the ranch someday. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. She doesn't understand that the world is changing, that ranching isn't always going to be enough. And you, what do you think? He looked at her for a long moment, those blue eyes serious. I think education matters. I think books and learning open doors. But I also think there's wisdom in the land, in working with your hands, in understanding that some things can't be taught in a classroom. I think maybe the best education is a balance of both. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone in Scottsbluff had said to her, and it caught Georgia off guard. She'd expected Beckett Xander to be all rough edges and cowboy swagger, not this man who spoke about balance and opportunity with such quiet conviction. That's a very enlightened perspective, Mr. Xander. Beckett, he said automatically, then shook his head. You're determined to keep me at arm's length, aren't you, Miss Thornton? I'm your sister's teacher. It wouldn't be appropriate for us to be familiar. Even if we're going to see each other every day, even if I already consider you a friend, we're not friends, Mr. Xander. We're barely acquaintances. He put his hat back on, adjusting it with slow deliberation. See, that's where you're wrong. I told you the other day you're not a stranger to me anymore, and whether you want to admit it or not, I'm not a stranger to you either. You know my name, you know my family, you know I care about education and worry about my sister. That's more than most people know about each other after just a few days. Knowing facts about someone doesn't make them a friend. No, but it's a start. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be in town every few days checking on supplies for the ranch. If you need anything at all, you just let me know. And Miss Thornton, you did good today. I can tell. Bonnie came home talking about you, and that girl never talks about school. He left before Georgia could respond, and she stood alone in the empty classroom, her heart doing that strange racing thing it seemed to do whenever Beckett Xander was around. She told herself it was just the stress of the first day, the exhaustion of managing 47 students, the overwhelming challenge of her new life. It had nothing to do with blue eyes or slow smiles or the way he said her name like it was something precious. Nothing at all. The first week of teaching passed in a blur of lessons and discipline, and gradually learning the rhythms of frontier education. Georgia discovered that her students were far more capable than she'd expected, hungry for knowledge in a way that Boston children, surfeited with privilege, often weren't. They devoured books, asked endless questions, and tried her patience with a mixture of mischief and genuine curiosity that kept every day unpredictable. Bonnie Xander remained a challenge, sullen and resistant to any lesson that didn't have immediate practical application. But Georgia noticed that the girl was always listening, even when she pretended not to be, and occasionally, Bonnie would ask a question that revealed a sharp, analytical mind hiding beneath the rebellious exterior. Beckett came to town twice that first week, always finding a reason to stop by the school either before or after classes. He brought books from his father's ranch library, old volumes that had belonged to his mother. He asked about Bonnie's progress with a concern that seemed genuine, rather than merely dutiful. And he talked to Georgia, conversations that started about education and somehow wandered into discussions about Boston and Nebraska, the differences between city and frontier, the challenges of building a life in a place where nothing was certain. Georgia told herself these conversations were merely the friendly exchanges of two adults in a small town. She ignored the way her pulse quickened when she heard his voice. She dismissed the fact that she found herself watching for him, disappointed on the days he didn't appear. She was a professional, a teacher, a woman who'd learned the hard way that trusting men, even charming ones, led only to heartbreak and ruin. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed, she sometimes let herself remember the way Beckett looked at her, as if she were something more than just the schoolteacher, as if he saw past her carefully maintained armor to the uncertain, lonely woman beneath. The second week brought new challenges. Several of the older boys, emboldened by her Eastern manners and feminine appearance, began testing her authority. They whispered during lessons, passed notes, and deliberately gave wrong answers to see if she'd notice. Georgia responded with a combination of stern discipline and strategic praise, separating the ringleaders and rewarding those who behaved properly. It was exhausting, this constant battle to maintain control, but she refused to let them see her struggle. On Friday of that second week, she was dismissing students when Tommy Walsh approached her desk, his freckled face troubled. "Miss Thornton, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Tommy. Why did you come here, to Scottsbluff, I mean?" "You're from Boston, where there are museums and theaters and everything nice. Why would you leave all that to teach in a place like this?" It was the question Georgia had been dreading, the one she'd deflected from adults but couldn't quite lie about to a child's honest inquiry. She sat down at her desk, so she was eye level with Tommy, and chose her words carefully. "Sometimes, Tommy, we don't choose the places we go. Sometimes life makes choices for us, and we have to decide whether to be bitter about it or to make the best of where we are. I came to Scottsbluff because I needed a fresh start, a place where I could be useful and build a new life. And I'm discovering that this town, for all its differences from Boston, has its own kind of beauty, its own possibilities." Tommy considered this, his young face serious. "My pa says you'll probably leave as soon as you save enough money, that Eastern ladies never stay out here." "Your pa may be right," Georgia admitted. "I honestly don't know what the future holds. But I'm here now, and while I'm here, I'm going to do my very best to teach you and your classmates everything I know. Can you accept that?" "I guess so." Tommy started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, Miss Thornton, I hope you stay. You're the best teacher we've ever had." He ran out before she could respond, leaving Georgia blinking back sudden tears. The best teacher we've ever had. From an 8-year-old boy who'd known her all of 2 weeks. It shouldn't have meant so much, but somehow it did. She was locking up the school when a horse and rider appeared from the direction of the XXX ranch. Not Beckett this time, but an older man with silver hair and the same strong features, though his were weathered by decades rather than years. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose body had been battered by hard work and time. "Miss Thornton, I'm Marcus Zander, Beckett's father." Georgia shook his offered hand, noting the calluses and the strength still present despite his age. "Mr. Zander, it's a pleasure to meet you. I wanted to come by and thank you for your work with Bonnie. That girl has been fighting education since she was old enough to talk, but Beckett tells me she's actually engaged in your classes. That's no small feat. Bonnie is very intelligent. She just needs to understand that education isn't meant to take her away from the things she loves, but to give her more tools to succeed at them." Marcus Zander smiled, and Georgia could see where Beckett had gotten his charm. "That's a wise perspective, Miss Thornton. I also wanted to invite you to dinner at the XXX on Sunday, after church. We're having a gathering for some of the neighboring ranchers and their families, and I'd be honored if you'd attend. Give you a chance to meet more of your students' parents in a less formal setting." The invitation surprised her. She'd expected to remain somewhat isolated, the schoolteacher who was respected but kept at a polite distance. But Marcus Zander was offering inclusion, connection, a chance to become part of the community rather than just its employee. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Zander. Thank you for the invitation." "Excellent. We'll send Beckett to collect you after services. No need to dress fancy, it's just a ranch gathering." He mounted his horse with less grace than his son but no less determination. "And Miss Thornton, I'm glad you came to Scottsbluff. This town needs people like you." He rode off, leaving Georgia standing in front of the school with a strange warmth spreading through her chest. People like you. As if she belonged, as if she had value beyond just her ability to teach multiplication tables and grammar. That Sunday, after enduring another of Reverend Harding's lengthy sermons, Georgia waited outside the church as families dispersed to their wagons and horses. She'd worn her best dress, a dark blue cotton with only modest trim, and had taken extra care with her hair, telling herself it was just about making a good impression on the families she'd meet, not about wanting to look nice for a certain blue-eyed cowboy. Beckett arrived on his bay horse, leading a smaller mare saddled for a lady. "Morning, Miss Thornton. Hope you're ready for a real Western gathering. Fair warning, it gets loud and chaotic, nothing like your fancy Boston parties." "I can handle chaos, Mr. Zander. I teach 47 students in one room every day." He laughed, that genuine sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Fair point. Can you ride, or would you prefer to take the wagon?" Georgia eyed the mare with some trepidation. She'd taken riding lessons as a girl, but that had been years ago, and those had been sedate trots through Boston Common, not 10-mile rides across Nebraska prairie. But admitting weakness seemed wrong somehow, so she straightened her shoulders. "I can ride." Beckett dismounted and helped her into the saddle, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and Georgia tried to ignore the jolt of electricity that shot through her at his touch. She settled onto the mare, gathering the reins with fingers she hoped weren't shaking, and Beckett swung back onto his own horse. "Stay close," he said. "The trail can be tricky if you don't know it." They rode out of town heading northwest, and Scottsbluff quickly gave way to open prairie, endless grass, rolling toward distant bluffs that gave the town its name. The sky was that impossible blue again, vast and overwhelming, and the wind carried the scent of grass and wildflowers and something indefinably Western. Georgia's mare followed Beckett's horse with a steady, even gait, and gradually, Georgia felt herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride. "You sit a horse well for an Eastern lady," Beckett observed after they'd been riding for a while. "I had lessons as a girl, though I'll admit this is quite different from riding in Boston." "How so?" Georgia gestured at the landscape surrounding them. "There, we rode in parks with groomed paths and other riders nearby. Here, it's just endless space. It's both terrifying and beautiful. Which do you feel more? The terror or the beauty?" She considered the question, watching the grass ripple like water under the constant wind. "I think I'm starting to feel more beauty than terror, though I'm not sure when that shift happened." "Maybe when you stopped being a stranger," Beckett said quietly. "Maybe when you started letting this place become home. I'm not sure I'm ready to call it home yet." "But you're not sure you're not ready either. That's progress, Miss Thornton." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Georgia found herself stealing glances at Beckett. He sat his horse with the unconscious grace of someone born to the saddle, his body moving with the animal's rhythm, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon in a way that suggested he was reading the land like she might read a book. He belonged here in a way she couldn't imagine ever belonging anywhere, rooted to this place by generations of work and sacrifice and love. The thought should have increased the distance between them, emphasized how different their worlds were. Instead, it made her want to know more, to understand what it meant to have that kind of connection to land and legacy. "Tell me about the Triple X," she said. "How long has your family owned the ranch?" My grandfather started it in 1854, when this whole area was still wild territory. He came from Texas with a herd of longhorns and a dream of building something that would last. My father grew up on the ranch, inherited it when Grandpa died, and built it into one of the most successful operations in the area. Now it's my turn to learn, to eventually take over when Pa's ready to step back. And Bonnie, where does she fit into that future? Beckett was quiet for a moment. Pa wants her to have choices. To be able to run the ranch if that's what she wants, but also to have the education and refinement to make a different life if she chooses. It's why he insisted she continue school, even though she fights it tooth and nail. She loves the ranch. Anyone can see that. She does. But loving something doesn't mean it will love you back. Ranching is hard, uncertain. Droughts, disease, market prices, all of it outside our control. Pa's seen too many ranchers lose everything because they couldn't adapt, couldn't read or figure numbers well enough to keep proper records. He wants better for Bonnie, better for both of us. There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested expectations and responsibilities Georgia couldn't fully understand. And what do you want, Beckett? He looked at her then, really looked, and Georgia felt that jolt again, that sense of connection that defied logic or propriety. I want the ranch, I always have, but I also want to know there's more to life than just cattle and grass. I want to read books and have conversations that aren't about market prices. I want to build something that matters, not just in terms of money or land, but in terms of legacy. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Georgia said softly. That's what I'm trying to do with teaching. Build a legacy that matters. Then we're not so different, you and I. We're completely different, Mr. Zander. Beckett, she conceded finally, because fighting it seemed pointless when they were alone on the prairie with only the grass and sky as witnesses. We come from different worlds, different backgrounds, different expectations of what life should be. Maybe, but different doesn't mean incompatible. Before Georgia could respond to that loaded statement, the ranch came into view over a small rise. The XXX was larger than she'd expected. A sprawling complex of buildings including a 2-story ranch house, several barns and outbuildings, corrals, and what looked like bunkhouses for ranch hands. Horses grazed in a large pasture, and cattle dotted the distant hills in brown and white clusters. It was impressive, substantial, the kind of place that spoke to generations of hard work and success. It's beautiful, Georgia said, meaning it. Wait until you see the view from the house. Ma picked the spot because she could see for miles in every direction. She said it made her feel free. The mention of his mother, casual and affectionate, added another layer to Beckett's character. Georgia wanted to ask about her, but they were approaching the house now, and people were emerging to greet them. Marcus Zander stood on the wide porch, and beside him was Bonnie, looking significantly less rebellious in a simple dress with her hair down around her shoulders. They were joined by a woman Georgia didn't recognize, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and flour on her apron. Miss Thornton, welcome to the XXX, Marcus called. This is Rosie Harding, Reverend Harding's sister. She helps us out with cooking for gatherings like this. Beckett dismounted and came around to help Georgia down, his hands again finding her waist, and this time, Georgia let herself acknowledge the warmth of his touch, the way her body responded to his proximity. He held her perhaps a moment longer than necessary before stepping back, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. He wasn't just being friendly or neighborly. He was interested, truly interested, in a way that went far beyond casual attraction. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The afternoon unfolded in a chaos of food and conversation and laughter. More families arrived, ranchers and their wives and children, and the house filled with noise and warmth. Georgia met so many people her head spun with names, but everyone was welcoming, curious about the Eastern schoolteacher, but not judgmental. They asked about Boston, about her impressions of Nebraska, about how she was managing with their wild frontier children. And through it all, she was aware of Beckett, watching her from across the room or stepping in to introduce her to someone new. His presence a constant, comforting thing that made her feel less alone in the crowd. After dinner, as the adults gathered on the porch to watch the sunset and the children ran wild in the yard, Bonnie approached Georgia with unusual hesitation. "Miss Thornton, can I show you something?" Georgia followed the girl away from the house, across the yard to one of the barns. Inside, in a stall lined with fresh straw, a mare lay with a newborn foal beside her, all spindly legs and enormous eyes. "She was born 3 days ago," Bonnie said, her voice losing its usual defensive edge. "Pa says she's mine to train and keep. I've been reading that book you assigned, the one about horses, and it's actually helpful. It explained things about training and temperament I didn't know." "I'm glad you're finding it useful," Georgia said carefully, sensing this was a significant moment. "I still think most of what we learn in school is useless," Bonnie continued. "But maybe not all of it. Maybe some things are worth knowing, even if they don't seem practical right away." It was the closest thing to approval Georgia had received from the girl, and she treasured it like gold. "That's all I ask, Bonnie, that you keep an open mind about learning. Who knows? You might surprise yourself with what you discover." They stood together watching the foal struggle to its feet, all awkward grace and determination, and Georgia felt something shift in her relationship with this difficult, brilliant girl. Not quite friendship, but understanding, the beginning of mutual respect. "Beckett talks about you," Bonnie said suddenly. "More than he talks about anyone. I think he likes you." Georgia's heart stuttered. "Bonnie, that's not appropriate conversation." "Why not? You're not married. He's not married. You're both adults. And I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Your brother is kind to everyone. It doesn't mean anything." Bonnie turned to face her, and those blue Xander eyes were far too knowing for 13 years. "You really believe that? You really think the way he watches you, the way he finds reasons to come to town, the way he talks about you when you're not around, that's just him being kind?" "Bonnie, I'm your teacher. This conversation is entirely inappropriate." "Fine. But you should know something, Miss Thornton. Beckett doesn't do anything halfway. When he cares about something, he commits completely. And I think he's starting to care about you. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" She left before Georgia could respond, leaving her alone in the barn with a new foal and thoughts that spiraled in dangerous directions. Was Bonnie right? Was Beckett interested in her as more than just a friend or casual acquaintance? And if he was, what did Georgia feel about that? She'd come to Scottsbluff to escape, to hide, to rebuild her life away from the scandal and shame of Boston. Romance, love, any kind of entanglement with a man was the last thing she'd planned for or wanted. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Beckett, the way he made her feel seen and valued and possibly beautiful for the first time in years. But wanting something didn't make it wise. She was still a stranger here, still uncertain about her future. And Beckett was rooted to this place, his life mapped out by generations of expectation and responsibility. What future could they possibly have together? She was still wrestling with these thoughts when Beckett found her in the barn, his tall frame blocking the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. "Bonnie showed you the foal," she did. "It's beautiful. She's trying to bribe you into liking her. It's working." He moved into the barn, coming to stand beside her at the stall, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. I wanted to thank you, Georgia, for being patient with her, for seeing past the attitude to the smart, scared girl underneath. It was the first time he'd used her given name without her title, and the intimacy of it sent shivers down her spine. She's not that hard to understand. She's just trying to figure out where she fits in a world that's changing faster than she can adapt to. Aren't we all, Beckett said quietly, trying to figure out where we fit? Some of us more than others. He turned to face her fully, and Georgia made herself meet his eyes, made herself not look away from the intensity she found there. Where do you think you fit, Georgia? I don't know. A month ago I would have said Boston, despite everything, but now, I honestly don't know anymore. Can I tell you where I think you fit? I'm not sure I want to hear this. I think you fit here, in Scottsbluff, teaching those kids who adore you, living in a place where people value what you do rather than judging you for what you've lost. And maybe, if you're willing to consider it, you fit with me. Georgia's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. Beckett, I can't. I'm your sister's teacher. I'm trying to establish myself as a professional, respectable woman. Getting involved with anyone, especially a prominent rancher, would compromise everything I'm working toward. Who says getting involved has to compromise anything? Who says two people caring about each other has to be a scandal or a problem? Because that's how the world works. Women in my position have to be beyond reproach. Any hint of impropriety and I'll lose my job, my home, everything I've worked for. I can't risk that. I won't. Beckett was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the barn's dim light. I respect that, Georgia. I do. But I also think you're underestimating the people of Scottsbluff. We're not Boston society. We don't condemn people for caring about each other, and we don't expect you to live like a nun just because you're the school teacher. You can't guarantee that. No. But I can promise that if you give us, a chance, I'll do everything in my power to protect you and your reputation. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Georgia. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that maybe you don't have to be alone anymore. That maybe you're not a stranger here anymore, not to me, and maybe you never have to be again. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility and promise and terrifying hope. Georgia wanted to say yes, wanted to step into his arms and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place and a person who could make her feel whole again. But fear held her back, the memory of her father's failures and her own disgrace, the certainty that happiness was something other people got to have. I need time, she whispered. Time to think, to figure out what I want. Can you give me that? All the time you need, Beckett said, though his voice was rough with something that might have been disappointment or understanding or both. But Georgia, while you're thinking, I want you to know something. You're not a stranger to me anymore. You haven't been since the moment we met. And whatever you decide, that's not going to change. He left her there in the barn with the mare and her foal and a heart that felt like it might break from the weight of everything she wanted and everything she feared. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts, and when Beckett helped her down from her mare in front of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment before letting go. Good night, Georgia. Good night, Beckett. She watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, and she stood there long after he disappeared, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that was both comfortable and confusing. Georgia taught her classes, slowly winning over even the most resistant students with a combination of high standards and genuine care. She attended church on Sundays, had tea with some of the mothers, and gradually began to feel less like an outsider and more like someone who might, possibly, someday belong. And Beckett came to town 3 or 4 times a week, always finding a reason to stop by the school, to bring books or ask about Bonnie or simply talk. They never again spoke about the conversation in the barn, but the knowledge of his feelings, of his offer, hung between them like a promise waiting to be claimed or rejected. Georgia tried to convince herself she was being sensible, maintaining professional distance, protecting herself from potential heartbreak. But late at night, she admitted the truth. She was falling for Beckett Xander, had probably been falling since that first encounter outside the mercantile, and all her careful reasons for keeping him at arm's length were really just fear dressed up as prudence. The moment that changed everything came in late June, nearly 2 months after Georgia had arrived in Scottsbluff. School was dismissed for summer break, and Georgia found herself at loose ends, uncertain what to do with her days now that she didn't have lessons to plan and students to teach. Mrs. Pembroke had informed her that she was still expected to maintain her residence at the boarding house and be available for any summer tutoring that families might request, but otherwise, her time was her own. She was sitting on the boarding house porch, reading a book and trying not to think about Beckett, when Mrs. Chen came out with a letter. "This came for you. From Boston." Georgia's hands trembled as she took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting. Her cousin Alina, the only family member who'd maintained contact after her father's death. She opened it with a strange sense of foreboding and read, "Dearest Georgia, I hope this letter finds you well and settled in your new position. I wanted to write with news from Boston. Your father's debts have been settled. One of his former business partners, feeling guilty about the circumstances of the bankruptcy, paid off the remaining creditors. Your father's name has been cleared, and the scandal has largely been forgotten in the wake of newer gossip. More importantly, I've secured you a position here in Boston, teaching at Miss Winthrop's Academy for young ladies. The salary is excellent, the housing comfortable, and you would be back among people who know and care for you. The position is yours if you want it. You need only write back with your acceptance, and I'll make all the arrangements for your return. Please consider this carefully, Georgia. I know you've made a life out there, but surely you must see this as the answer to your prayers. A chance to come home, to reclaim the life you were meant to live. With love and hope." Alina. Georgia read the letter 3 times, her emotions swinging wildly between relief and panic. Everything she'd wanted, everything she'd thought she needed, was being offered to her on a silver platter. Return to Boston, to civilization, to a world she understood. Leave behind the dust and wind and uncertainty of the frontier. Leave behind Scottsbluff. Leave behind her students. Leave behind Beckett. The thought of never seeing him again felt like a physical blow, and in that moment, Georgia understood with perfect clarity what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was home, truly home, for the first time in her life. And she was in love with a cowboy who told her she wasn't a stranger, who'd seen past her defenses to the woman underneath, who'd offered her not just his heart but a place to belong. She had to tell him. Had to tell him before fear convinced her to make the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that would break both their hearts. Georgia didn't even bother to change her dress or grab a bonnet. She walked straight to the livery stable, hired a horse, and rode out toward the XXX ranch with Alina's letter clutched in her hand and her heart pounding against her ribs. She found Beckett in one of the corrals, working with a young horse, his shirt stained with sweat and dust. He looked up when he heard her approaching, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw her face. "Georgia, what's wrong?" She dismounted clumsily, nearly falling in her haste, and he was there immediately, steadying her, his hands strong and warm on her arms. "I got a letter from Boston," she said, the words tumbling out. My father's debts are settled. The scandal is over. I've been offered a position at a prestigious academy. I can go home, Beckett. I can go back to everything I thought I'd lost." His face went very still, very careful. "That's wonderful news, Georgia. Congratulations." "Don't." She grabbed his shirt, fisting her hands in the fabric. "Don't congratulate me when I don't want it. Don't be noble when I came out here to tell you I'm not going back. I'm staying here in Scottsbluff, with you, if you still want me." For a heartbeat, Beckett didn't move. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. "If I still want you. Georgia, I've wanted you since the moment I saw you step off that train. I've been waiting for you to realize that you belong here, that this town needs you, that I need you. Yes, I still want you. I'll always want you." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. "I was so scared. So convinced that letting myself care about you, about this place, would end in disaster. But losing you, leaving you, that would be the real disaster. You were right, Beckett. I'm not a stranger anymore, not to Scottsbluff, not to you. I'm home." He kissed her then, right there in the dusty corral with the sun beating down and the wind blowing around them. And it was nothing like the chaste, proper kisses Georgia had experienced in her carefully chaperoned Boston courtships. This was fierce and tender, and full of months of longing finally given permission to exist. His hands cradled her face like she was something precious, and she rose on her toes, pressing closer, trying to show him without words everything she felt. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Beckett rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me this is real. Tell me you're really staying." "I'm really staying. For you, for my students, for me. This is where I belong." "Then I have something to ask you, and I know it's fast. Probably too fast by Boston standards, but out here, when you know something is right, you don't waste time. Georgia Thornton, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my everything?" Georgia felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears, the kind she hadn't cried in years. Yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage and partnership and building a life together. Yes to everything you're offering, everything we can create together. He kissed her again, and then he was laughing, swinging her around in the corral like they were dancing, and Georgia laughed too, the sound carrying across the prairie like music. They told Marcus and Bonnie that evening, both of whom reacted with enthusiasm that suggested this wasn't exactly surprising news. Marcus welcomed Georgia to the family with a bear hug that knocked the wind out of her, and Bonnie, in a rare display of emotion, hugged her too. "I knew it," the girl said smugly. "I told you he liked you." The news spread through Scottsbluff faster than a prairie fire. By the time Georgia returned to town the next day, wearing Beckett's grandmother's ring on her finger, everyone seemed to know that the schoolteacher and the rancher were engaged. Instead of the scandal Georgia had feared, she was met with congratulations, well wishes, and knowing smiles that suggested the entire town had been waiting for this to happen. Mrs. Pembroke, surprisingly, was one of the first to offer her approval. "You'll continue teaching, of course. Married women can teach in frontier towns, unlike back east. We can't afford to lose you, Miss Thornton. Or should I say, Mrs. Xander-to-be." The wedding was planned for August, giving Georgia time to write to her cousin Alina explaining her decision, and to prepare for her new life as a rancher's wife, while maintaining her teaching position. Beckett wanted to marry sooner, but Georgia insisted on doing things properly, with time for banns to be posted and for his family to plan a proper celebration. Those summer weeks before the wedding were some of the happiest of Georgia's life. She and Beckett spent every possible moment together, chaperoned by Bonnie or Marcus, or whoever else Beckett could dragoon into accompanying them. They rode across the prairie, Beckett teaching her the names of plants and animals she'd never known existed. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, dreams and fears and plans for their future. They stole kisses in the barn, on the porch, in the school when no one was watching, each touch a promise of the life they'd build together. Georgia also spent time with Bonnie, and their relationship transformed from teacher-student to something closer to friends, or perhaps future sisters. Bonnie showed her around the ranch, teaching her practical skills that would serve a rancher's wife well. How to tell if a cow was sick. How to predict weather by watching the sky. How to ride like someone who belonged on the prairie rather than a Boston debutante on a sedate trail horse. "You're getting better," Bonnie said one afternoon as they raced across the grassland. "You don't ride like an Easterner anymore." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is. You know, I wasn't sure about you at first. Thought you'd be like all the other teachers trying to make us into something we're not. But you're different. You see who we are and try to make us better versions of that, not different people entirely." "That means a lot, Bonnie. Thank you. And you make Beckett happy, happier than I've ever seen him. That matters more than anything else." George's throat tightened with emotion. "He makes me happy too, happier than I ever thought possible." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, and Georgia marveled at how much her life had changed in just 4 months. She'd arrived in Scottsbluff broken, desperate, convinced she'd never be anything but a stranger in a strange land. Now she was engaged to a man she loved, building friendships, planning a future that felt solid and real and full of possibility. The wedding day dawned clear and hot, a perfect August morning in Nebraska. The ceremony was held in the church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Georgia wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen and several other women had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Bonnie had picked from the prairie. Beckett wore his best suit, looking simultaneously uncomfortable and devastatingly handsome. And when Georgia walked down the aisle on Marcus Zander's arm, the look on Beckett's face made her knees weak. Reverend Harding performed the ceremony, and when Beckett said, "I do," with a voice that rang clear and certain through the church, Georgia felt something settle in her chest, some restless part of her finally finding peace. They were married, legally and officially, and when Beckett kissed her, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the XXX, a sprawling celebration with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Georgia danced with Beckett, with Marcus, with students and parents and townspeople, until her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. But she didn't want it to end, this perfect day, this celebration of love and new beginnings. As the sun set and the stars began appearing in the vast Nebraska sky, Beckett pulled her away from the party, leading her to the porch where they could be alone for a moment. "Happy, Mrs. Zander. Happier than I have words to express, Mr. Zander." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together watching the last light fade from the sky. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up Boston, the academy, the life you could have had?" "Not for a single second. That life was what I thought I wanted because it was what I knew. But this, what we have, what we're building together, this is what I actually need. You are what I need." "Good, because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me, choosing this place." "That sounds like a very good plan, Cowboy." He turned her in his arms, kissing her under the emerging stars, and Georgia felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit themselves back together. She'd come to Scottsbluff a stranger, running from scandal and debt, and the ruins of her old life. She'd been certain she'd never belong, never fit into this rough frontier world. But Beckett Xander had seen her, truly seen her, and told her she wasn't a stranger anymore. And in becoming his wife and choosing this life, she'd found something more precious than all the Boston society balls and prestigious academies in the world. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found herself. The years that followed were full and rich, and sometimes challenging in ways Georgia never could have anticipated. She continued teaching, returning to the school each fall to educate new generations of frontier children. Beckett worked the ranch alongside his father, gradually taking on more responsibility until the XXX was effectively his to run. They built a house on ranch property, a comfortable two-story structure with windows that faced the bluffs and a porch where they could watch storms roll across the prairie. Their first child, a son they named Benjamin Marcus, arrived in the spring of 1884, squalling and red-faced and perfect. Georgia continued teaching through most of her pregnancy, only stopping a month before Benjamin's birth, and returned to the classroom that fall with the baby often sleeping in a basket at the back of the room. The students were fascinated by him, and even the most unruly boys behaved better when Benjamin was present, as if his innocence demanded their best behavior. Bonnie adored her nephew, spending hours holding him and singing to him and teaching him ranch skills almost before he could walk. She graduated from Georgia's school at 15, having finally admitted that education had value, and became an essential part of the XXX's operations. She never married, choosing instead to devote herself to the ranch, eventually becoming one of the most respected ranch managers in the territory. A second child, a daughter named Grace Aliner after both grandmothers, arrived 2 years after Benjamin. She had Beckett's blue eyes and George's auburn hair, and from the moment she could walk, she was following her father around the ranch, determined to do everything her older brother could do. Georgia watched her children grow up with a mixture of pride and amazement, grateful every day for the unexpected path her life had taken. Marcus Xander passed away in 1890, peacefully in his sleep after a life well lived. Beckett grieved but also celebrated his father's legacy, the ranch that had been built through decades of hard work and passed down to a new generation. The XXX continued to thrive under Beckett's management, weathering droughts and hard winters and market fluctuations through careful planning and adaptation. Georgia taught for 15 years before finally stepping away from the classroom, her body and spirit both ready for a new phase of life. She was succeeded by one of her former students, a bright young woman who'd gone east for teacher training and returned to Scottsbluff specifically to take over her mentor's position. The torch passed, the legacy continued, and Georgia transitioned into new roles as full-time ranch wife, mother, and eventually grandmother. Benjamin grew into a strong, thoughtful young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. He married Sarah Kincaid, one of the twins from Georgia's first class, and they built their own house on XXX land, continuing the family tradition. Grace, wild and independent, left Nebraska for a few years to attend college in Omaha, but eventually returned, married a neighboring rancher's son, and helped expand the Xander holdings through strategic partnerships and business acumen that impressed everyone. Through all of it, through the births and deaths, the triumphs and challenges, the evolution of the West from wild frontier to settled territory, Georgia and Beckett's love remained constant. They grew older together, their hair silvering, their faces weathering like the land they loved. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching sunsets, and Georgia sometimes thought about the frightened young woman who'd stepped off a train in 1882, convinced she'd never belong anywhere again. What are you thinking about? Beckett asked one such evening when they were both in their 60s and the ranch stretched around them, full of children and grandchildren and life. About how wrong I was. About how certain I was that I'd always be a stranger here. And now I know this is where I was always meant to be. With you, building this life, loving this place. You told me that very first week that I wasn't a stranger to you anymore. You were right. I never really was I? From the moment I saw you, I knew you belonged here, belonged with me. I just had to wait for you to figure it out. Best decision I ever made, figuring it out. Second best, Beckett corrected. The best decision was saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Georgia laughed, that same free, joyful sound that had surprised her on her wedding day and never stopped surprising her through all the years since. You're right. That was definitely the best decision. He pulled her closer, and they sat together as night fell across the prairie, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life and a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The train had brought her to a town of strangers all those years ago. But the cowboy had been right. She wasn't a stranger anymore, not to him, not to Scottsbluff, not to the vast Nebraska plains that had become her home. She was Georgia Thornton Zander, teacher, rancher's wife, mother, grandmother, beloved member of a community she'd helped build and shape. And she wouldn't have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought her here.